If you've ever felt like you're drifting through life with no anchor, then perhaps these stories are meant for you. They're not magical tales, no miracles, just quiet slices of life where someone once collapsed, once sat in silence through unbearable pain, once felt so lost they wished to disappear. And yet, in that exact moment, a broken bell rang, a temple door creaked open, a stranger poured a warm cup of tea, and everything quietly began to shift. There was a woman from the streets who believed her life was beyond saving, until she met a silent man beneath a Bodhi tree. A man who knocked on a temple door all night, not to be rescued, but simply needing someone to sit beside him in the dark. A little novice wandering with his mother's ashes, trying to learn how to let go. A man who once considered ending it all over a pair of stolen sandals. A broken bell that still rang at dawn. A coffee shop that opened only before the city awoke. An old man who kept the ashes of the one who betrayed him, not for hate, but for forgiveness. And a young boy who learned how to say goodbye, not with words, but with silence. 8 stories. No one perfect. No one saved. Yet somehow, each person found their way back to themselves. If you've ever believed you didn't deserve forgiveness, if you felt alone in the noise, if you're tired from running endlessly without direction, then sit down, take a deep breath, and listen, because somewhere in these gentle stories, you just might find yourself. 8 Buddhist stories that gently wake you up from within. In this noisy life, we're always running. Running to make money. Running so we won't be left behind. Running to find something that makes us feel enough. Feel at peace. Feel, I'm okay. But have you ever paused to ask yourself, could it be that what we're looking for lies in what we always overlook? There are stories, very simple ones. No miracles, no mysteries, just a few words, a glance, or a moment of silence. Yet they're enough to make us stop. Today, I invite you to sit down, to listen to 8 Zen stories, brief, quiet, but ones that might make you realize you don't need to run so much through life. Story 1, The Blind Man and the Mirror. On a misty hillside, along a worn dirt path leading to an ancient monastery, lived a blind man in a quiet little thatched hut. People called him Arun, a name that meant dawn. Yet ironically, he had never seen the light. Arun was born blind. From a young age, he had grown used to being labeled useless, a burden, and whispers that always followed him like a shadow. He grew up in the darkness of others, shadows of judgment, pity, and sometimes shadows of his own making. Never having seen his own face, Arun imagined it, distorted, ugly, unworthy of being looked at. And somehow, the older he got, the more he hated the body he couldn't even see. They say, when you see nothing, the mind stays calmer. But Arun wasn't calm. Inside him simmered a quiet torment of not knowing who he was, what he was, and whether he even deserved to exist. One day, hearing that a Zen master was giving a teaching at the hilltop monastery, Arun decided to make the journey, not to beg for sight, but to ask one question that had haunted him for years. Who am I, if I cannot see myself? The climb was hard. Stones scraped his bare feet as he slowly made his way up the trail, guided only by a walking stick and careful steps. The scent of pine, the rustling leaves, and the distant chime of temple bells led him gently to a place that felt somehow beyond time. When he reached the monastery courtyard, the Zen master was seated under a tree, eyes gently closed, his fingers moving slowly across prayer beads. Arun couldn't see, but he could feel something strange in the man, not grandeur, not kindness, but emptiness. So empty that it felt like he was being listened to, even before saying a word. Arun knelt down and pressed his palms together. Master, I've not come here seeking sight. I came with a question. People look into mirrors to know who they are. But I, blind since birth, how can I ever know who I am? The master kept his eyes closed, not answering right away. The breeze moved gently through the trees. The leaves whispered like unspoken thoughts. Finally, he opened his eyes and spoke softly. Humans have more than one mirror. There is the mirror for the face, and the mirror of the heart. Though your eyes are blind, your heart is not. If you learn to look inward, you may see yourself clearer than anyone who has ever looked into a glass. Arun was stunned. The mirror of the heart? Looking inward? But inside him were only old voices. You're worthless. You're ugly. You should never have been born. His voice trembled as he asked, "But Master, if all I find inside is darkness, what can I possibly see?" The monk gently placed his hand on Arun's chest. "The heart is like still water. It only appears dark when disturbed. Let it settle, and you will see, not with the eyes, but with silence." Arun did not return home that day. He asked to stay at the monastery for a few weeks, to learn how to see through the mirror of the heart. Each morning, he meditated. At first, it was agony, itching skin, restless thoughts, and those same cruel voices screaming louder than ever. But slowly, he stopped fighting. He let the voices come and go, like clouds passing across a quiet sky. One morning, as the forest whispered softly in the early light and birds called faintly from the treetops, Arun sat alone behind the monastery in deep meditation. And suddenly, he felt something. Not with his body, not with his ears, but inside his chest. Something opened, like someone had lit a single candle in a room long abandoned. There were no words, no chants, no visions. But for the first time in his life, Arun felt warmth, and something that could only be described as wholeness. When the day came for Arun to leave, the master walked him to the trail. Before departing, Arun asked one final question. "Master, is it possible that those who see with their eyes still do not see as clearly as I do now?" The Zen master smiled gently. "Some people have open eyes and see nothing. Others close their eyes and see deep within. Seeing doesn't depend on the eyes. It depends on whether we dare to look inside." Arun's story, the blind man searching for a mirror, not to see his face, but to understand his being, leaves us with a quiet truth. The Buddha is not in the statue, not in the temple. The Buddha is in the moment we pause, breathe, and truly look into ourselves, without judgment, without fear. That's when the mirror of the heart begins to reflect. And that's when, perhaps, we are no longer blind, even if our eyes have never seen the sun. Story 2. The child who asked, "Where is the Buddha?" It was a quiet afternoon in a remote countryside. The kind of day when the drizzle clings to the earth like a forgotten lullaby. The red soil had turned slippery, and the faded grass drooped like the weary hair of the old. Along a dirt path that led to a hidden monastery nestled among bamboo groves, a barefoot child trudged forward. He didn't know where he was going, nor did anyone ever tell him where he should go. He only knew that somewhere at the end of that path, there was a place called temple, and in that temple was something or someone called Buddha. The boy's name was Kala. No one gave him that name. It was just what an old lady from the market once called him, because his skin was dark like ash. Kala was an orphan, no parents, no birth records, no one who claimed him as kin. He survived on scraps from the marketplace and the instinct to be as silent as wild grass. There, yet forgotten. One day, Kala overheard a passerby say, "If you're suffering, go to the temple. Ask the Buddha." He didn't know what Buddha was. A god? A spirit? Someone who could give him a blanket? A name? A warm hand? That evening, when his belly ached with hunger and his fingers were blue from the rain, Kala followed the muddy path up to the temple. The temple was quiet. The gate was not locked. The courtyard smelled of moss. The Buddha's face was blurry, but the faint smile strange. Not joyful, not sad, just still, like someone who listens and yet is untouched. Kala knelt down. He didn't know how to fold his hands. He didn't know what to call Buddha. He just whispered the first full sentence he had ever dared to speak aloud to anyone. "Buddha, are you there?" There was no reply, no sound. No one appeared. Only the rain tapping softly on the roof. Kala began to cry, not because he was disappointed, but because, for the first time in his life, he had finally spoken what he had long carried in silence. He wanted to be heard. Moments later, an old monk quietly stepped out from behind the altar. He didn't scold the boy for entering uninvited. He didn't ask anything. He simply looked at Kala for a long time, then turned and walked into the kitchen. Kala thought he had left. But just a few minutes later, the monk returned, carrying a steaming bowl of rice. He placed it in front of the boy, still without saying a word. Kala, shivering with hunger, looked up with tearful eyes and asked, "Master, is the Buddha here?" The old monk sat beside him, gazed at the rising steam, and gently said, "When someone quietly scoops a bowl of rice for you, that's when the Buddha is here." Kala froze. He didn't quite understand. And yet, he did. Not with his mind, but with something deep in his chest. He picked up the bowl, ate slowly, spoon by spoon, as if he were feeding not just his body, but his soul. Each mouthful warmed more than his stomach. It filled the cold, empty places inside him, where once there had been hunger, loneliness, and that quiet ache of being unwanted. For the first time in his life, Kala didn't feel like leftover trash. He felt like someone worthy of being fed, of being seen, even if seen through silence. Kala stayed at the temple, first for a few days, then for years. He learned to sweep leaves, light the fire, cook rice, recite chants. But above all, he learned something few children are ever taught. To be human is not to be better than others, but to be whole within yourself. Every time a stranger came to the temple seeking food, Kala would quietly scoop them a warm bowl of rice, just like the monk had once done for him. Sometimes people asked, "Does the Buddha really exist?" Kala would smile softly, then point toward the kitchen and say, "Whenever someone quietly serves you a bowl of rice, that's when the Buddha is present." The Buddha is not a god who grants wishes. He is not a statue, nor a symbol on an altar. The Buddha is the moment we silently show up for another, when we listen with no agenda, when we offer warmth in someone's coldest hour. Kala no longer needed anyone to call him by name, because now he understood. Each time he served someone with a gentle heart, he became a vessel of compassion, and in that compassion, the Buddha was breathing with him. Story 3. The Broken Bowl and the Silent Woman. That year, before spring could fully arrive, a young woman came to a small forest monastery nestled deep among bamboo trees. She didn't say her name. She didn't ask to become a disciple. She simply knelt at the gate, placed down a small cloth bundle. Inside it, a porcelain bowl, broken clean in two. The head monk, then in his 60s with a beard like winter frost, looked at her and asked softly, "What have you brought with you, child?" She didn't reply right away. Only after a long moment did she speak, her voice barely above the wind passing through bamboo leaves. "I've brought something I can no longer hold." They say she was once the wife of a painter. They lived in a small house by the river, where flowers bloomed each season and birds called each morning. She loved him with a quiet kind of love, like sunlight, and he loved her with paintings he never sold, only made for her. They once had everything, and then they had nothing. No one knew what happened. Some said he ran away with another woman. Others whispered that he vanished into the forest and never returned. But the woman, she who was left behind, didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't rage. She simply stopped cooking, stopped opening windows, didn't speak a word to anyone for over a year. Then one day, she picked up the porcelain bowl, the last thing they had shared, the one object left untouched in that hollow house. She held it tightly, and without meaning to let go, the bowl fell, broke cleanly in two. No sound, no mess, just no longer whole. She stared at the broken bowl as if seeing herself, not screaming, not shattered, but no longer one. When she brought the broken bowl to the temple, the head monk didn't ask questions. He simply accepted it and said, "Starting tomorrow, come to the pottery room. We will learn to mend what has been broken." She didn't understand, but she nodded. On the first day, she learned to mix paste. On the second, to clean the cracks. On the third, how to fill the lines with gold, following the ancient Japanese art of kintsugi, where the goal is not to hide the break, but to make it shine. For months, she asked nothing, said nothing. She just sat among shards and bowls, mending with shaking hands and clouded eyes. One morning, as the monk watched her quietly at work, he asked, "What do you think of a bowl that has been broken?" She paused. "I once thought it was no longer a bowl, but now, I'm not sure." He smiled. "A thing only loses its value when we no longer see ourselves in it. A broken bowl, handled with care, can hold more than a perfect one, because it holds a story." And then, one late spring morning, the woman brought the mended bowl to the temple gate. The golden lines gleamed where cracks had once been. It wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful in a quiet, honest way. Beautiful because it had been broken, and still remained. She bowed to the monk and said, "I bring nothing with me now, but somehow, I'm no longer afraid of dropping myself." He nodded, eyes calm and deep as a still pond. The Buddha does not appear only when things are whole. He appears when we kneel down and begin picking up our own pieces. We are not lesser because we've been broken. We only lose ourselves when we refuse to look at our cracks. Like porcelain, each life carries its own fractures. But if we slow down, tend to the damage, and learn to love not in spite of the wound, but through it, the very cracks begin to shine. And perhaps, the Buddha is already there, in the places we once tried to forget. Story 4. The Cry in the Void. There was a man named Min, living in a high-rise apartment in the heart of the city. He had a good job, a nice car, a beautiful girlfriend, and a bank account that never dipped below comfort. And yet, one day, he woke up, sat in the middle of his perfectly furnished apartment, and felt empty, not sad, not happy, just a kind of dry silence, as if a desert had formed inside him. And even the wind could no longer stir a sound. He began withdrawing from friends. Meals became meaningless repetition. Work, once his pride, now felt like a machine he no longer operated. He saw a therapist. The doctor said, "You're experiencing an existential crisis." Min chuckled bitterly. He had everything people dream of, except the one thing that mattered. A reason to wake up in the morning. One night, while cleaning out an old drawer, he found an old photograph. It was him as a little boy, sitting on his father's shoulders, laughing under the blazing sunlight of the countryside. He stared at the photo, and suddenly began to cry. He didn't know why. The tears came from somewhere far, far inside. Not because his father was gone, not because his childhood was over, but because he realized, when was the last time I laughed like that? The next day, Min took leave from work. He got in his car and drove back to the countryside where he grew up. He had no plan, just a voice whispering inside, "Go find what you've dropped." The village roads were the same. The river still curved gently. Only the old family home was gone. He wandered along the dike in the late afternoon and spotted a small temple hidden among bamboo. He didn't know why, but he walked in. No one invited him. No one called. At the center of the main hall sat an old Buddha statue, not gilded, not ornate, just still, bathed in soft sunlight filtering through wooden slats. Min sat down, in silence, and for the first time in years, he cried aloud. A young monk passing by heard the sobs. He didn't speak. He just sat beside him. They said nothing for nearly an hour. Just two people, one who had lost himself, and one who simply listened as that lost voice found its way back. Finally, Min whispered, "Do you believe someone can have everything and still feel like they don't exist?" The monk nodded. "That person is not mad. They've simply slept too long inside dreams drawn by others. Every time we no longer know why we live, it means we've been living someone else's life." Min sat stunned. The monk's words rang like a bell inside him. He lived well, but for whom? He succeeded, but by whose standard? He smiled, but was the joy ever his? The monk looked at him gently. The Buddha never told us to abandon the world. He only reminded us, before doing anything for the world, know who you are. And a single cry, even one heard by no one, is often the first wake-up call. Min didn't stay long. He returned to the city. But from that day on, every morning, before getting out of bed, he placed a hand over his heart and asked, "Today, what am I living for?" If no answer came, he didn't rush. He cooked a slow, mindful meal, took a walk without his phone, played an old song he once loved, or simply sat, just to listen to himself. And slowly, he began to hear his heart beating again. Not for a deadline, not for anyone's praise, but to return to being human, truly alive. There are cries no one ever hears, but they are the first bells, waking us from lives lived for someone else. And perhaps, the Buddha is not some distant god, but the moment we cry, right in the middle of a seemingly full life, and realize there's not a single drop of ourselves left. Story 5. The Old Craftsman and His Last Wooden Table. In a small alley near the foot of a mountain lived an old man in a quiet wooden house. People called him the Last Craftsman, because he was the only one in the region who still made traditional furniture. No machines, no glue, just hands, tools, and heart. In the past, people came from far and wide to order tables, chairs, and bookshelves from him, not because they were perfect, but because they felt alive. When you sat at one of his tables, you sat up straighter without knowing why. When the elderly sat in his chairs, they said their burdens felt lighter. But time passed. Machines took over. Skyscrapers rose. No one visited that little alley anymore. The old man stayed, alone, among the scent of wood shavings and the soft smoke of incense drifting each evening. One day, a young man came from the city. He was an architect, searching for something authentic for a new coffee shop. When he stepped inside the old house, he was drawn to a worn wooden table in the middle of the room. Its surface scratched, legs uneven, but somehow, in the sunlight, it glowed. He asked, "Sir, is this an antique design?" The old man chuckled. "No, that's the last table I intended to make." "Why the last?" "Because these days, people want matching sets. They no longer want soul, just symmetry." The young man fell silent, then asked, "What if I asked you to make another? One that doesn't match anything else. One that doesn't belong to anyone but itself. Would you do it?" The old man looked at him for a long moment, then smiled gently. "Would you sit at it to drink coffee, or to sit back down with yourself?" From that day on, the young man stayed. Each day, the old man taught him how to select wood. Not the hardest kind, but the one that knew where it would naturally break. How to plane the surface, not to make it flawless, but to keep some of its knots, like the knots in a human life. How to balance the legs, so that even if one was weaker, the table would still stand steady with the strength of the other three. And as they worked, the old man told stories. Stories of a life spent carving. Stories of his late wife, who once said, "Every table you make should be a place where someone can sit down and leave just a little bit of their burden behind." After 21 days, the table was finished. No glossy paint, no decorative carvings, just thick wood for sturdy legs and a quiet scent that warmed the chest. The young man placed his hand on it, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. He didn't know why. The old man looked at him and said, "Do you know why I still do this work? Because the Buddha once said, not everyone can sit in meditation, but everyone needs a table where they can finally set something down. I don't preach, but every table I make is an invitation to sit, to slow down, to hear the wood breathe, and maybe to hear yourself again." The young man brought the table back to the city, not to the coffee shop. He placed it in the center of his home. Every night, he sat there. No phone, no music, just a warm lamp, a blank notebook, and the table, carrying the spirit of an old craftsman and the quiet echo of a Buddhist teaching. The place where you sit down is the place where you begin again. Not all healing begins with meditation. Sometimes it begins with a table, a place where you finally come home to yourself. Story 6. The Little Girl and the Broken Bell. In a foggy mountain village, tucked against the slope, stood an old temple. Not many people visited. Yet every dawn, a single bell would ring through the forest. It was not loud. It didn't command. It simply sounded like a quiet sigh dissolving into the mist. No one knew who rang it. Until one day, a little girl carrying firewood paused at the gate and saw an old blind man. He was the bell ringer. Each morning, before the fog had lifted, he would feel his way along the stone wall until he reached an old bell. Its bronze body cracked on one side. Many wondered why he still rang a broken bell. Some said he's old. He can't tell the sound is wrong. Others whispered, "It's just an old man's habit, nothing more." But the little girl didn't think so. She stood still, then softly asked, "Why don't you replace it with a new bell?" The old man smiled gently. "Because this broken bell knows how to ring with people's pain." From that day on, she came every morning. At first, it was curiosity, but slowly, it became a quiet need to sit beside the old man and listen. She told him about her mother, who was sick, about her father, who had gone far away, about how some nights she curled up in bed and wished she could disappear. The old man didn't question, didn't advise. He only said, "Each morning when the bell rings, try placing inside it the things you cannot say aloud." One rainy day, the girl didn't come. The next morning, she returned, eyes red, cheeks pale, carrying a small cloth bundle. She placed it in the old man's hands and whispered, "My mother passed away. I want to send her final scarf into the sound of the bell." The old man nodded, saying nothing. That day, the bell rang longer than usual. At one point, the tone faltered, but then it steadied, as if the bell itself was trying to hold on to one last warmth. Time passed. The girl grew taller, her hair longer, her eyes clearer. She still came every morning, sitting quietly behind the old man. No one knew that she was the one who kept the broken bell from falling in storms, silent guardian of its fragile strength. One day, The old man no longer came out. The girl, now a young woman, walked out alone. She felt her way along the stone wall, just as he had taught her. Standing before the cracked bell, she whispered, "I don't know if I can ring it like you did, but I'll try, because I know. Some people can only feel alive when they hear this bell." The bell rang. At first, it trembled. Then, it grew steady. There were still parts out of tune, still moments of silence. But it sounded warm, unmistakably alive. A passerby stopped and asked, "Why not fix the bell? Or get a new one?" The girl smiled. "Because some people are just like this bell. Not perfect, not whole, but still able to awaken something deep in the mist." There is a saying in Buddhism, all things, flawed, broken, silent, can be the path. What matters is not perfection, but the gentleness not to throw them away, and the patience to sit down and listen. Story 7. The cafe that only opens at dawn. Tucked away in a quiet alley of a bustling city, there was a strange little cafe. No signboard, no bright lights, and it only opened from 4 a.m. to 6 a.m. Every day, locals called it the Dawn Cafe. First-timers found it puzzling. Who drinks coffee at that hour? When most people are still half asleep, not yet hungry, not yet ready to face the world. Yet, somehow, each morning, the cafe welcomed a few visitors. A motorbike taxi driver, a street sweeper, an old man with a vintage radio, and sometimes, someone who had simply made it through a sleepless night. The cafe owner was a man in his 50s, with prematurely gray hair and eyes as gentle as still water. No one knew his real name, but he always greeted guests the same way. "Welcome. Please, sit down before the day begins." One winter morning, a young woman walked in. Dark circles under her eyes, dry lips, trembling hands. She sat in silence. Didn't order. Didn't look at anyone. Eventually, the owner brought her a cup of hot ginger tea. No questions, no words. She looked up, about to refuse, but he smiled. "Here. If you don't know what to ask for, we bring you whatever might warm your heart." She said nothing, but tears quietly began to fall. From then on, she came every day, not for coffee, but to sit in silence, with him. They never spoke about the pain. He never asked why she cried. They simply watched the sun rise together, as it stretched gently over old rooftops. One morning, before the sun appeared, she finally asked, "Sir, what should someone do when they're too tired and don't know where to go?" He answered, "Then don't go anywhere. Just sit still, and let the light find you." She laughed. For the first time in months, it wasn't a forced smile. She looked at him, eyes glistening. "Are you a monk?" He shook his head. "No. But once, when I had nothing left, someone poured me a cup of tea and said, 'You don't need to be saved. You just need someone to sit beside you, so you don't feel abandoned.'" After that, the girl stopped coming every morning. She no longer needed to. She was warm enough to keep walking. But on rainy days, she would return, sometimes with a warm scarf, an old book, or just a smile. The cafe still opens at dawn. Still no sign. Still welcomes those who don't really know why they came. Except that, they needed a quiet place to sit before the day begins. There's a Buddhist teaching that says, a person who truly listens is already a bodhisattva. Not everyone who sits in meditation becomes enlightened. But if you can sit beside someone without judgment, you've already become a refuge for a weary soul. Story 8. The Urn by the Riverbank. They say that in a distant land, an old man lived in a small wooden house by the river. He had no clear profession. Each morning, he picked vegetables. At noon, he cooked rice. By dusk, he swept the yard. Anyone who asked him anything was met with a quiet smile. People called him the keeper of ashes, because for years, he had kept a small clay urn close by, holding the ashes of someone he never spoke about. A young boy lived nearby. After school, he would stop by. At first, out of curiosity, but soon, he found comfort just sitting quietly, watching the river, listening to the old man tell stories. Stories that had no beginning or end. Of a boat that never rode. Of a bird flying, not knowing it was flying. Of a wanderer who forgot his way home. One day the boy asked, "Grandpa, who's in that urn?" The old man fell silent, then said, "Someone I once hated with all my heart, but also loved with all my soul." In his youth, he had a best friend. They grew up together, shared dreams, shared hunger, shared roasted sweet potatoes beneath the mountains. But one day, the friend betrayed him, stole the woman he loved, and left him with a crack in his heart that never healed. He ran away, wandered for decades, trying to escape the pain, like someone walking through fog, believing the farther he went, the more he'd forget. But the more he ran, the more empty he felt. Then one day, he heard his old friend had passed away. No family, no one to claim the ashes. Unwanted. The old man went quietly, took the urn, brought it home, placed it by the window, where the river could still be heard. The boy stared wide-eyed. But why would you keep the ashes of someone who betrayed you? The old man smiled, eyes damp but kind, like late afternoon clouds. Because I've learned something. Forgiveness isn't for the one who hurt you. It's for yourself. If you keep hating, you remain a wanderer. But once you let go, you finally have a home to return to. From then on, each evening, the old man and the boy sat by the urn, listening to the river speak. He no longer told sad stories. Instead, he taught the boy how to breathe gently, how to listen, how to place your feet on the earth as if kissing it. One day he said, "If I'm no longer here one morning, don't cry. Just take the urn to the river and let it go. You don't need to tell who's who. Just let both of us return." Years later, the man passed away. No will, no photo, no funeral. Just one boy, now a quiet teenager, carrying the urn, walking alone to the river. Just before sunrise, he sat still for a long while, then gently placed the urn onto the water. The river said nothing. It simply accepted, the way it receives the sun each morning. The Buddha once said, "Hatred is never appeased by hatred. Only by love is hatred appeased." This is an eternal law. Not everyone has an enemy, but everyone carries something they haven't yet released. And sometimes, an urn, a river, a storyteller, is all it takes to begin learning how to come home. Maybe you've listened to all 8 stories, or maybe you just stopped briefly, at a glance, a bell, a cup of tea, a whisper soft as mist. But if something within you stirred, even just a little, then please believe this. You are already coming home. Not home to a religion, not to doctrine, but home to yourself, whole, gentle, and full of quiet light. Together, we've walked through 8 quiet journeys. A woman from the streets who met the Buddha beneath a tree. A man who knocked on a silent temple and heard his own heartbeat. A young novice carrying his mother's ashes in search of release. A man who once wanted to end it all because of a pair of worn sandals. Then, a cracked bell that still rings each morning. A cafe that only opens before the world wakes. A child who learns about forgiveness from the ashes of betrayal. And finally, an urn let go into a river with a whisper. You don't need to be saved. You just need someone to sit beside you, so you don't feel left behind. 8 stories, no preaching, no teaching, just a falling leaf, a drop of water, a trail of incense smoke. And sometimes, it's those softest things that stir the soul the most. If you are sad, or weary, or lost, please sit down, with your breath, with your heartbeat, and know, truly, you are not alone. Because as the Buddha once said, be a lamp unto yourself. No one can save us with words, but when we choose to sit still, to listen, to forgive, to touch our own pain, the light will come on its own. Thank you for walking this path with me. If this brought warmth to your heart, please share it, like candlelight passed from one flame to another. And if you saw yourself in any of these stories, remember, you, too, are a story worth telling.